This session will be recorded for those who were unable to make today's session. And for those on the line, no need to take a copious amounts of notes. We'll definitely send a playback to you to watch on demand. Without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Tom. Again, thanks for joining, everyone. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And thank you to all of you for joining for this webinar. I'm happy to announce that it's over 50 degrees in Boston, and some real signs of spring are now in the air. It's quite beautiful here. So I want to talk about some of the tendencies that we see in midterms, provide you with a few projections for 2022, talk about some of the developments between now and November that might change those projections, and then the implications if the projections hold. So this is going to be familiar to you, if not exactly this chart, at least the message behind it. This is the tendency in midterms, and that's that the out party nearly always wins. And so these are the results for the last 100 years of midterm elections. You can see only 3 victories in there for the in party. I think another thing to note is that even when the in party prevails, it doesn't get much of a bonus. So those green bars are pretty small. Some of the red bars, the losses, are pretty large. And the major ones, of course, represent wave elections where the out party really dominated the midterm election. If you look at the Senate, you see the same tendency, not quite as pronounced. Now we're dealing with a smaller number of races here, so statistically you'd expect more variation. But even here, the out party tends to do well in the midterm. The one time the in party did really well was 1934. And of course, this is the first congressional election after FDR took office, and the popularity of the New Deal really propelled Democratic Senate campaigns in 1934. But ordinarily, you like to be the out party when it comes to Senate elections. Now, political scientists have offered, there's actually a third, I'm not going to talk about it, but I've emphasized kind of 2 theories about why this happens. One is called surge and decline, and that's based on changes in the electorate from the midterm, between the midterm and the presidential election. And then the second is the referendum theory, and that one focuses on the president's popularity and performance. So let me speak first about House elections. So if you think about surge and decline, when you have a presidential election, you get a surge of voters. People will go to the polls for that election, but won't show up in the midterm. And compared to the people who vote in midterms, those extra voters in a presidential election, they're more responsive to the mood of the moment. So they're more likely to kind of back the winning side in the presidential election. That obviously helps the winning presidential candidate, also helps down ballot. It helps the congressional candidates of his or her party. And then you come to the midterm, and of course those voters stay home, and that erases that advantage that the in party had in the presidential election. So to estimate that, and this is a crude estimate, I'm going to use self-defined independents. They're a larger part of the presidential electorate than they are in the midterm. And independents, as you know, are more responsive to the mood of the moment. Democrats and Republicans nowadays pretty much vote along party lines, and the swing vote comes largely out of the independent voters. And then I went back to 1980 and calculated, if you look at the advantage that the presidential candidate, the victor, had among the independent voters in the presidential election, each point advantage that the presidential winner had is associated with a loss in the midterm of 2.2 House seats. So in some ways, the more you capture the mood of the moment in a presidential election, the bigger hit you're likely to take in the subsequent midterm. So here's 2020 and Biden, Trump, just looking at the independent vote in 2020, it's a 14-point advantage for Joe Biden. And if you take that 2.2 seats, that translates into a predicted Republican gain of 31 seats in November of this year. The other theory is the referendum theory. And the idea behind this is quite simple and straightforward. Once you get into the Oval Office and you start to make policy decisions, you're going to end up making more enemies than friends. When you make people angry, they're more likely to vote against you than people who are happy with you or to vote for you, at least in terms of changing their mind. And that leads to declining popularity on the part of the president, and that weakens the appeal of the president's party in the midterms. And you can see just how difficult it is for presidents to maintain the popularity that they have when they first come into office. So these are all the presidents, except for Biden, since John F. Kennedy in 1961. And you can see between year one and year two, all but two of them lost support as measured by the presidential approval rating. The two exceptions are the Bushes, and they both had the wind at their back. So George H.W., he was in 1989. That's when the Berlin Wall came down, a couple of other favorable things there. He wasn't all that popular when he came into office. So his approval rating was actually higher in year two than in year one. And George W., of course, 9/11 occurred in his first year and really sent his approval rating skyrocketing. But all the others lost support, public support, between year one and year two. And here's where Biden sits. He's down 14 points, roughly, since he took office in terms of the presidential approval rating. Now, what I've done here is to create a scatter plot where the x-axis is presidential approval rating and the y-axis is the out-party share of the House vote in the midterm election. And as you can see, the more unpopular the president in the midterm year, the greater the out-party share of the House vote. You get a premium if the president is unpopular. And here's where Biden sits. If you take literally what I've done here, his approval rating at this point would predict that Republicans will win the 2022 House vote. I'm talking about the national vote now, by 53% to 47%. Now, interestingly, that's exactly the same number that pollsters are giving us from the generic congressional vote. There are pollsters out now asking the question, if the November election were held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate for the House or the Republican candidate? I've stripped out the undecideds, so this is just the two-party vote. But you can see at the moment, a majority of those who've decided are leaning toward the Republican Party. Again, 53-47, the same thing that the model predicted. So what does that mean? If Republicans actually should get 53% nationally of the House vote, what would that mean in terms of seats? What I've done here is to try to estimate that using the midterm elections from 1972 to 2018. And you can see the larger the percentage of the national vote that is won by the out party, the more House seats they're likely to pick up. Another thing to note in here is that same thing I mentioned earlier, that the out party has kind of a natural advantage when it comes to the midterms. So you can look at a 53-47 in terms of the out party victory. That translates into 35 seats on average for the out party. If the in party wins 53-47, it only picks up 8 seats. So there's kind of an inherent advantage in any case to the out party when it comes to the midterm election. And where are we then in 2022? We had predicted or projected 53-47 Republican and that translates into a gain of 35 House seats, very close to what the projection was using the surge and decline theory. Now, in fact, I don't think Democrats are going to lose 30 or more seats. And here's the reason. If you go back and you look at those midterm elections where one of the parties won more than 30 seats and as much as almost 60 seats or so, there was a condition that allowed them to do that. The in party had a very large majority in the House and therefore was protecting a lot of seats. In other words, there were more seats up for grabs in terms of what the out party could reasonably expect to get. But if you look at the House today, Democrats have a very narrow majority, a 10-seat majority. They have 222 of the seats in the House of Representatives. And to me, that means they have fewer seats to lose in November. So it doesn't change the prediction that Republicans will seize control of the House in November, but I think it will be by less than a pickup of less than 30 seats. Now, let me slip over to the 2022 Senate elections. And here I have the advantage of someone else's work. I didn't have it for the House elections because some of the states are still going through the redistricting process. And for those of you familiar with the Cook political report, they're not estimating House races in those states where redistricting is yet to come. But they have done their estimates and are doing their estimates on an ongoing basis about the Senate races. And here's where they see the 34 Senate races that are up for grabs in November. They list 15 of them as solidly Republican, 10 solidly Democratic, and the rest leaning. Now, there are 34 seats up, 33 regular seats, plus the one in Georgia that was one in so that was a 2-year stint in Georgia. So that's where the 34th seat comes in. But if you look at this chart, to hold on to the Senate, because they have a 50-50 split, the Democrats have to get 17 of those 34 races. And Republicans look like they have 15 already. Democrats only 10, which means to get to 17, they have to pick up the leaning Democratic seat, and they'd have to pick up all the toss-up seats, or if they got 5, they'd have to pick up one of the leaning Republican seats, or if they lost 2 of those, they'd have to pick up both of the leaning Republican seats to keep the 50-50 split that allows them to act as the majority party in the Senate. Now, here are the races that Cook lists as toss-up leaning Democratic and leaning Republican. I'll give you a few seconds just to kind of look at it to see which races are in these categories. And then what I did was to go into each of those races and do some Googling to see the polls. One nice thing about Senate races, they're high profile enough so that even this early, even months out from the November election, in these states, there's some polling around the Senate race. And here's what the polls look like at the moment. Republican victories in 4 states. There's kind of some air between the Republican and Democratic candidate in Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Democrats kind of have a lead only in one of those, New Hampshire. That's Maggie Hassan's seat. And then there are 4 that are too close to call. And if this stands just as it is, Republicans would control the Senate by at least 52-48. And if they happen to win up all the toss-ups, they'd have a 57-43 advantage. So as with the House, the Senate, by these projections, looks like it will go Republican in the fall. Now, a final factor to consider when we think about November is what's called the enthusiasm gap. And that refers to the gap between the eagerness to vote of those in one party versus those who identify with the other party. And we know from past experience that enthusiastic voters are more likely to show up at the polls, and particularly more likely to show up for a midterm election as compared with a presidential election. Well, here's the enthusiasm gap from the four most recent presidential midterms. You go back to 2006, and this is of course, halfway through George W. Bush's final term. The enthusiasm gap was on the Democratic side. There was an 11 percentage point difference in the people who were very interested in voting in the midterms on the Democratic side compared to the Republican side. And in that election, the Democrats picked up 30 seats. Then you get to 2010. Of course, this is in the aftermath of the Tea Party and the response to the Affordable Care Act going through the Congress of the United States. It was a Republican year. The enthusiasm gap was on the Republican side, plus 15, and Republicans in 2010 picked up 63 seats. And you can see the pattern here. The party that has enthusiastic voters is more likely to pick up seats in the midterm. So what about 2022? Well, at the minute, here's where it stands. Republicans say they're more interested in getting to the polls in November than do Democrats. The gap right now is plus 14 percentage points on the Republican side. So that also bodes well for the Republicans. If it stays like this, they're going to win the turnout war. Okay, so thanks to Donald Rumsfeld, we've got unknown knowns in the world that we can now talk about. But let me talk about some that could impact the outcome of the 2022 midterm elections. The approval rating of Biden, partisan gerrymandering, and the ballot access laws. So here's Biden's approval rating since he took office. This is that 14 percentage point drop that I talked about earlier. Now, if Biden's approval rating starts to go up, that would improve Democrats' chances in the fall. But the Federal Reserve recently projected that high inflation will be with us through the rest of 2022. Economic growth is going to slow. And both of those factors in the past have been associated with low presidential approval ratings. Then you look at Ukraine and the Ukrainian crisis. His approval rating has gone up by only 1 point since the start of that war. And that's different than a lot of past crises of this type, where you've got a fairly large rally around the flag boost in presidential approval, but Biden isn't getting it. So it's a bit unclear, at least at this point, what could prompt a dramatic upswing in Biden's approval. Here's his real problem in terms of the approval rating. Come November, over 90% of Democrats I would predict, will vote for the Democratic House candidate and Senate candidate. Same thing on the Republican side. The swing vote in this election, like the swing vote in all recent elections, are going to be the independents. And they're overwhelmingly, almost 2-to-1, disapproving of the job that Biden is doing as president. And again, we have to go back to 2020 when he won the independents by 14 percentage points. He's really underwater with the independents, and that's going to drag down his party's candidates in November, unless he can somehow turn that around. Here's another indicator of Biden's approval problem. So on the right, I have what the president is doing. Economic sanctions on Russia, sending weapons to Ukraine. Large majorities of Americans approve of both of those policy actions. And then you put it in the context of Joe Biden. Do you approve of Biden's policies on the Ukraine war? And he's barely above 50%. He's kind of stuck where he is. He's having real trouble translating what he's doing in Oval Office into a positive approval rating. Let's talk a little bit then about partisan gerrymandering. So, as you know, in 2019, the Supreme Court basically took the federal courts out of partisan gerrymandering, saying that courts really aren't in a position to decide where those lines should be drawn. And so, basically, it's unrestricted, at least at the moment. But that's only unrestricted in a certain sense. So racial gerrymandering remains unlawful. So partisan gerrymandering, unrestricted. Racial gerrymandering, not. And then the other thing is that some state laws and constitutions put limits on practices like gerrymandering. And that can bring the state courts, which are not bound in ruling on state law, that can bring them into these gerrymandering cases. So here's what it looks like in terms of redistricting. So we just had the census, House seats have been reapportioned. States are in the process of redistricting. Republicans have a clear advantage in terms of the number of House seats that they're going to be able to redistrict. More than twice the number that are under the control of Democratic states. And then we have a fairly large number where it's both or neither. Both is when you have divided control, as you do, for instance, in North Carolina with the Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. And that neither refers to those states that have independent or quasi-independent redistricting commissions. And then we have some states, of course, that don't redistrict because they have only one House seat. So here we're talking about states like Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota. But that's the lineup with a clear Republican advantage when it comes to redistricting. Now, Republicans had that same advantage because they had that wave election in 2020 that put them in control of a lot of the states. And they control more redistricting of House seats in after the 2010 census as they do this time. And the Center for American Progress did a really exacting look at that redistricting that the Republicans did and concluded through gerrymandering, they were able to pick up an additional 19 seats in the 2012 elections. In that election, interestingly enough, Democrats won the national House vote, but didn't win the House. In fact, Republicans won the House quite comfortably. So I think Republicans aren't going to get quite that same advantage this time. And here's some reasons for that. One is that Democrats were a bit relaxed when it came to redistricting after the 2010 census. They're showing less restraint this time. New York Democrats really redistricted that state in a way favorable to their party. Could result in a pickup of 4 Democratic seats. Illinois Democrats did the same thing, redistricted much more aggressively, could add 2 additional House seats on the Democratic side. And then Democrats were prepared this time. They weren't prepared after 2010. They had the legal teams in place this time to watch what Republicans in the states they control were doing around redistricting and jumped on, as soon as the redistricting was out, jumped on those they thought they could legally challenge. And they've already had some success with that strategy. So in Alabama, and this is around racial redistricting, a federal district court struck down the first attempt by the Alabama legislature and basically is forcing them to redraw the state in a way that will produce 1 more Democratic seat. And then in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina, the state courts took away from the Republican-controlled legislature redistricting. Those seats collectively have, or those states collectively have 46 House seats. The Supreme Court last week upheld Pennsylvania and North Carolina courts getting involved. The Ohio court, that one's still working its way through the courts, but it looks like the Ohio state court's going to have a large say in Ohio. And in every one of those cases, it's going to result in Democratic gains compared to what it would have been if Republicans had totally controlled the redistricting in those states. And then here's another reason I think that gerrymandering is not going to yield as much for Republicans this time. And this is the sorting, the geographical sorting that has been going on over the last 10, 15 years in this country, where increasingly Democrats are concentrated in urban areas, Republican elsewhere. It makes it harder for states to kind of do the gerrymandering when you get these concentrations. So this gives you a sense of just how dramatic this sorting has been. So the 2009-2010 Congress, this is the result of the 2008 election. That's not all that long ago. And the map on the left shows the distribution of House seats as a result of that election. And you can see a lot of blue in Middle America. Well, the 2018 midterm, you look at that map and the result of that map, and there's not much blue there anymore. There's not a lot of room for gerrymandering when you get this kind of exaggerated geographical sorting. And the effect of that between gerrymandering and the geographical sort is we get a shrinking number of competitive House seats. Now, the standard here for whether a House seat is competitive or not is whether the two presidential candidates in the previous election were within 5 percentage points of each other in that House district. Now, obviously, for 2022, that's an estimate, and the New York Times has projected that to be 38. I suspect that might be a little bit low. But the point here is we have fewer and fewer over time competitive House seats. And that means there are fewer opportunities to pick up House seats in a midterm election because we're dealing with the situation of more safe seats than previously. Now, Senate seats are somewhat more competitive. And what I've done to create this chart, I relied on a Cook political report using 2020 for the House and then the last 3 presidential elections for the Senate. And you can see that Senate races are somewhat more competitive than House races. But then when you start to drill down on Senate races, they're becoming less competitive. And here's one indicator of that. This is the percentage of Senate winners from the same party as the state's most recent presidential winner. And we're pushing up toward 100%. And what that means is that the state is increasingly voting either entirely Democratic when it comes to these top races or entirely Republican when it comes to these top races. That's a sign of declining competitiveness. That means states are getting more blue and more red. Here's another indicator of that. This is whether the delegations in the Senate are split or not. So for each year, each of those small boxes, whether blue, red, or gray, indicate the status of the 2 senators from that state. And so if it's a small red box, both the senators from the state are Republicans. If it's a small blue box, both are Democrats. The gray box are the split delegation, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat from the state. And what you can see over time is increasingly, is that the number of split delegations is diminishing. Increasingly in states, it's very hard if you're from one party to win. And we're getting down to the point now where split delegations are getting quite rare. Okay, let's talk briefly about ballot access. So on the Republican side, as you know, a number of the Republican-controlled states have passed laws tightening ballot access. Some of those laws are still under review in state and federal court, so we don't know whether they're going to hold. They'll probably hold for the primaries. Whether they'll hold for the general election is a bit unknown. And then Democrats haven't been sitting by either. So they've kind of changed the rules around the Motor Voter Act of 1993, which in its original form was opt-in. When you went to the motor vehicle office or you went to a social welfare office, you had to be under motor voter offered the chance to register. But to be registered, you had to say yes. Well, what Democratic states are doing is you have to say no, and that makes a big difference. Oregon was the first one to change from kind of yes to no, opt in to opt out. And the yield on motor voter tripled as a result. Vermont was second. There, the registration rate doubled through motor voter. So you get more Democrats, presumably, through that. Now, the combined impact in Republican states trying to shrink access to the ballot, in the Democrats states trying to expand access to the ballot, one thing we can predict about that, it's going to make states less competitive. The blue states are going to be bluer. The red states are going to be redder. And what we know is that these rules do affect the turnout rate. And what I have here is a chart that I created from data that in part collected by me, in part collected by someone else. So on the horizontal axis, you see the state rank and voting barriers. I did not do that. And I've cited the source of that, where they went through and looked at the states and their voting laws, and then ranked them according to how easy or difficult it was to vote. In my home state of Minnesota, for example, they have same-day registration. That would push it toward the easy side of voting. Some states close down their registration 30 days before Election Day, which the Supreme Court has ruled is the longest time period that you can in terms of closing down registration. And you can see here, and then what I did on the vertical axis was to do the state turnout rate in 2020. And you can see that the easier it is to access the ballot, the higher the voter turnout rate. Now, what happens if Republicans take control of Congress, as the models predict? Well, it's going to make it tough for Biden. So I went back to 1952 to create this chart. This is from the CQ voting studies. And this is a pretty relaxed view of president's kind of legislative power. This is based on the bills that they back in Congress. This is not necessarily their major initiatives like the second round of infrastructure that Joe Biden would like to get. But you can see if Congress is controlled by their party, their success rate is much higher than when one or both houses is controlled by the other party. And to give you an idea of just exactly how big a difference it has made to the recent presidents, here's Trump's legislative success score, 2017, 2018, Republicans controlled Congress, Democrats took control in 2019 of the House, and his success rate plummets. Obama had the same experience, and Biden will have the same experience if Republicans win the House or the Senate in November. Now, let's look ahead briefly to 2024, and then I'm going to wrap up with that. So the question here is, does the midterm election predict the outcome of the next presidential election? So let's assume Republicans win in 2022. Does that increase their odds statistically of winning in 2024? And the answer is not really. Unlike kind of being the out party predicts who's going to win in the midterms, winning the midterm doesn't have much predictive quality when it comes to the next presidential election. I think the Democrats' chances in 2024 are going to hinge on the economy. This is a nice study that was done by Lynn Vavreck at UCLA. There's a clear relationship between if the economy is moving ahead, if there's growth, the in party tends to do pretty well. When it's not the case, then the out party does well. I think the success of Biden in 2024 is very much going to depend on whether the economy really starts to move upward. So the question for Biden, is he going to be like Reagan? Reagan was in trouble in the second year of his presidency. His approval rating had dropped sharply, but then the economy turned around. And by 1984, it was, as Reagan said, morning in America, and he won a landslide re-election victory. or will Biden be like Jimmy Carter, where the economy didn't turn around? And in fact, we went into a period of stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation. And of course, that set the stage for Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980. At the moment, it looks like Biden's trending a bit more like Carter than he is by Reagan. But 1984 or 2024 is quite a ways off in political terms. I'll leave you with this one. I think if things don't get much better, Biden's best chance of winning is if Donald Trump is the Republican presidential nominee. So this is a poll that was reported 2 days ago. So at the moment, Biden, despite being way down in approval ratings, is tied with Donald Trump in terms of who people would vote for in 2024. And the reason, of course, Biden is doing well against Trump is that Trump has a low approval rating as well. And, so I think if Trump is the Republican nominee in 2024, that will be a drag on the Republican ticket. Whether it will be enough of a drag on the Republican ticket for Democrats to win if the economy is pretty weak, that's an open question. So let me stop there.